This podcast is brought to you in partnership with EVA International Media Limited. Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virch, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. And today I'm super excited to have a special volcano and underground guest on. Dr. Hunter Knox. She is an earth scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, where she works across the engineering field and geosciences to execute multidisciplinary field scale research and development projects for the U.S. Department of Energy. That's a mouthful, Hunter. That was hard to say.
I know. It was a good test for the linguists in the room.
No kidding. That's like if you're an actor, you know how they do go to get ready for whatever.
That's right. Being a scientist is really no different. That's all those words have to come out of your mouth all in one
That's
sentence.
funny.
So
I'll use that to practice for my next acting gig.
yeah.
So how did you get to be what are you a doctor of, by the way?
Uh,
Volcanology or
that's a good question. My undergrad
philosophy?
philosophy, some days.
Yeah, PhD.
I started my career at Colorado School of Mines. I have a bachelor's in geophysics from the school in Golden, and then I went to New Mexico Tech, and my PhD is actually in earth and environmental science with a specialty in geophysics. But that doesn't really tell you anything about what I did. So when I went to the School of Mines, I actually specialized mostly in electrical and electromagnetic methods. I had this great mentor named Dr. Kaufman. He's still alive. He's a very cool dude. And he taught me a lot about that part of geophysics. And shockingly enough, when I left mines, I switched gears entirely and became a seismologist. So
you talked about electrical, but you're
mhm.
studying the ground. I assume geophysics is like the earth. So
Yeah.
what does electricity
Oh,
have?
yeah. Good question. So geophysics is really, I think about it like it's analogous to in the medical field, what doctors do in CAT scans and MRIs, right? So we just use either seismic waves or maybe we'll use electrical current to interrogate the earth and make like a 3D CAT scan of what is there. We're measuring the electrical properties, which tie back to things like the pore volumes or the water content or the fluid content that is in the subsurface. We measure seismic velocity, which has to do with strength of the rock parameters. And so I think you're trying to infer from geophysics something that maybe a reservoir engineer cares about, or maybe someone who is working on waste contamination or plume projects, things like that. So geophysics is a way to use like the same kinds of approaches in the medical field to understand what's beneath our feet.
Very cool. So in my work with NOV at PNNL, we were very interested in one of your electric techniques to see what's in the dirt, to see what's down below. So you mentioned seismic. Seismic is sound. So seismic is like an ultrasound that's using sound waves. And the other ones are using electricity, which is not really MRI because that's magnetic, right?
That's right.
But it's using not sound.
Not sound, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's all wave propagation, right? In the end, it's all electrical or electromagnetic or seismic wave propagation. And that's really what geophysics hones in on and tries to use to understand how either like what the distribution of fluids or fractures or material content is in the subsurface. This is how we find gold. This is, how we find oil. This is how we mitigate when we have waste spills and things like that. So this is
you've had some waste spills up there.
yeah, yeah.
You have
There's
some background on that?
I have a little bit. I haven't worked too much at Hanford. I know.
What is Hanford?
Yeah, Hanford. So in the Manhattan era of science and of the national labs, there was a place called Hanford Works, and it's just north of Pacific Northwest National Laboratory on the Hanford Reservation. And it's where the United States produced the plutonium, largely all of the plutonium that went into the US nuclear stockpile. And that process, that means there's like a number of nuclear reactors that sit on the Columbia River. They're all catacombed now. We don't make plutonium anymore. We don't refine plutonium. And so now it's cleaning up really that effort. And when they separated the plutonium after it was enriched, a process is very challenging. And so there was a lot of waste that was generated. And now it's trying to figure out what to do with that waste and how to store it safely so that it doesn't further contaminate the earth or harm humans or animals or the environment.
Right. No, it's a big story that I didn't know until I drove. But I remember seeing this when I'd fly over Washington State at night. I'd see this green thing glowing green at night, and I wondered what it was.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
There's no
But
glowing green thing. There's no like beacon out there. There is a space where there's not much anymore.
mhm.
Yeah, there's some fascinating history about the national labs in Hanford and Oak Ridge and how that,
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
how the all started.
Well, I know nuclear is not, I don't think, your main thing, but you said that we don't produce plutonium anymore. And that kind of feels like a problem because we still need plutonium. Did we just we made enough for thousands of years and we don't need to make any more? Or I know NASA uses it sometimes for space probes.
I think plutonium's used in a lot of things.
Yeah.
My understanding is that, we don't refine plutonium anymore. But to be honest with you, I don't really know.
Right. That's not our thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So so you're doing this work at the National Lab, and I didn't know a lot about it. My Air Force Academy classmate's a manager out there, and that's how I got tied in with your organization at PNNL. But I knew loosely that there were national labs. I'd heard about Livermore. I'd heard
Mhm.
about Los Alamos. There's a couple famous. The one in Tennessee.
Oak
Um,
Ridge.
yeah, Oak Ridge is famous. But there's like 13, I think. Can
I
you?
think there's somebody will fact check me on this, but I think there's 17.
There's a lot. Yeah.
There's a lot. There's more than a dozen national labs, and I've actually worked at two of them. I've worked at Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque and PNNL.
Mhm.
They're two very different organizations. So
Mhm.
Sandia and Los Alamos and Livermore are national security labs, and so they primarily are funded by the NNSA, and PNNL is
What's that?
funded the National Nuclear Security
Yeah.
Administration. This is going to be like the acronym soup test.
Yeah, hey, as Air Force and NASA, I'm with you. But
So
my audience is not. So
yeah, it's true, and hopefully I'll get them right. So we have PNNL is an Office of Science lab, so it's stewarded by a different part of the Department of Energy, and it just means that the research scale is kind of more broad, more fundamental, which is one of the reasons I was attracted to coming up here. Is
mhm.
I get to work with a team of the most talented subsurface scientists, I think, in the world,
Mhm.
and they're great people, and we get to do cool things. So
The good thing, I always thought of the difference between science and engineering. For science, you're trying to understand like kind of why, and in engineering, you're just trying to get something to work. And the beauty of a national lab is that you get to do science projects that
mhm.
might produce something, that generates revenue and might not. But
That's
I was really surprised. It's not entirely a science project, because the way I understand it, you don't really, your budget needs to come from other sources. Like it was almost a capitalist model, how you get revenue, right?
well, so
It's not just government grants or
it's not just government grants, but I'd
right.
say, and someone in upper management could tell me how much money comes in via government grants and via, sort of private or state funded entities. It's the majority. So in my career, I can tell you, I've only really worked on one project that wasn't funded by the government. It was a sizable one, but certainly not the largest one I worked on. So I think more often than not, it is funded by the Department of Energy, most
Right.
most of the work. I think the thing people maybe don't understand is it's actually a lot like being a professor, but without having the students.
Right. That I misspoke. It's not that it's not government grant money, it's that you actually have to compete.
Yeah. So we
There,
compete, yeah, we
right.
compete ideas. And it's interesting, right? So maybe if I wasn't in such a small, close-knit community of subsurface scientists, right? Because really that community is small, relatively small in the United States. Um, it would be different. But when we compete against our friends and colleagues. So
Right.
that's an interesting endeavor. It's what we've learned and what we've tried to do is we recognize, right, that the total sum, right, when you do something together and there's like a really collaborative spirit, that whole is more than just the sum of the parts.
Mhm.
And I think for a long time there was like real competition between the laboratories, and to some degree there is still today, and it will continue forever, right? Humans are kind of naturally competitive
Mhm.
organisms.
Yeah.
So, but we've started to stand up more collaborative efforts, and you're starting to see that, the labs are leveraging their like strengths and it across the organizations, and that is producing a better outcome for the taxpayers.
Mhm.
Because that's
Oh,
really the mission, right? Like doing
right.
science for fun is great.
Right.
I've done science for fun when I
Right.
was in the university, but right now, really what I do is science and on the benefit of the taxpayers.
Yeah. Well, and the stuff, let's talk about
Yeah.
why underground is important. I mean, first of all, like understanding earthquakes and fault lines is important. Understanding where there's going to be volcanic activity and how that is important. Understanding where oil and gas is and where minerals are. And what I'm working on now is understanding how to put the carbon dioxide that we've made back underground. There's lots of like reasons, right? Why underground is not only cool. Do you know Bill Mullberger by any chance? He was our NASA. He trained the Apollo guys as a young 20-something-year-old, and I was lucky enough as a astronaut candidate to have go out and do field geology training. So we took those big um gravitimeters, I think. They're like super sensitive gravity measuring devices. They're
Yeah, gravimeters. You got really,
gravimeter, yeah.
really close. That's
Yeah,
good. That's a
that was
hard
20
word.
years ago. I did that 20 years ago. But you tweak it and it tells you how much gravity there is there, which is a little bit different than how much gravity there is 200 feet away. And you can tell where fault lines are doing that. So anyway, so he trained the astronauts about doing geology on the moon, and I mean, we're not going to the moon anytime soon, but it was fun to do it. And he he used to call them that he hated vegetables. He just liked his rocks, and anything that was green or growing, he was always complaining about vegetables. The vegetables are covering up. I can't tell what rocks are there because the vegetables are covering them up. So it was his joke. He was definitely a rock guy, not a biology guy.
Yeah, I sort of resonate with that statement. I've done a lot of field work in the desert, and actually my PhD was in Antarctica.
Oh
So then
wow.
ice covers the rocks, but
Yeah.
yeah,
A lot of ice in some places.
a lot of ice. I had a really fortunate experience. And it's kind of cool, right? So there's something called the National Science Foundation in the
Mhm.
United States, and it's funded through the government. And my PhD was funded that way. And we studied a volcano called Mount Erebus
Mhm.
in Antarctica, and
Mhm.
it sits right above McMurdo, which is
Mhm.
the one of the US bases.
Right.
And so I spent about 90 days in Antarctica, and I lived for 45 of them up in a tent at about 12,000 feet with no running water.
Antarctica is high. It's very
Yeah.
high elevation.
Well, and the barometric pressure is lower, right? So it
Yeah.
feels even higher. It's hard to acclimatize in Antarctica, but we melted snow for water and
Mhm.
lived in tents on the ice, and I planted seismometers all over the mountain, and yeah,
That is so cool. So
yeah.
you were based out of McMurdo?
No, I lived up on top of the volcano,
Or,
um,
on the in the field on the
in the
ice.
field in a remote field camp for about 45 days. It was incredible.
that sounds amazing. You know, I went to Edmondson, Scott.
No, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It was
Yeah,
I was like a guest speaker on this tourist thing, so it wasn't really an official thing, but it was so spectacular. It was freaking free. Well, our base camp was on the coast, so it was fine. It was like 30s,
30.
20s. On the
Yeah.
coast, it's not bad. In the summertime, this was January, so it was
Yeah.
or it was December, so it was Antarctic summer. The coast was fine. I got pictures of me in my Astros t-shirt, but man, so that Amundsen Scott's the South Pole. That's the actual South Pole. It
It's a
is freezing cold. I imagine Mount Erebus was pretty chilly too.
Yeah, we had it was like the worst weather for an austral summer on record in 30 years the year I went. And so it was very cold. We were getting temperatures well past minus 40, and that's a fun
In the
number.
summertime.
Yeah. Well, because it's so high, and
Yeah.
so it's but I got to stare into the hot, gooey center of a volcano, which was both like thrilling and terrifying simultaneously. Um, and it just, you learn a lot about yourself in those
Yeah.
situations, as I'm sure you know, right? You get into isolation and you learn to work with people, and
Yeah.
you learn a lot about yourself that you kind of different when you come back.
Yeah.
And
What an
uh,
amazing experience.
it was, like I said, NSF funded it. What a great experience.
Yeah.
And it taught me, I mean, so really when I think about it, right, it was that experience that taught me so much about what I do for the national labs now. It was really like I had to get lots of equipment, like a semi load of equipment from New Mexico to Antarctica.
Right.
I then had to help schedule helicopter rides to
Mhm.
go get those instruments where they needed to be. I had to retrieve the data. I had to come back and process it. It all lives in a public database called Iris.
Mhm.
And then I had to produce science with it. And so, really, I mean, that's still what I do today. Whether
That's
it's
that's
a
amazing.
semi load of equipment that goes to somewhere in New Mexico. We have an explosives test pad down there that with Sandia National Labs. That's a lot of fun. And then, we had this big experiment in the old Home State gold mine, which is now the Sanford Underground Research Facility.
Mm. So is Erebus active?
It is. Yep.
That's interesting.
It's a Strombolian type volcano, so it's more like Stromboli. It produces the magma has gas trapped in it, and it produces these large slugs of gas that kind of creep up the
So it's like
pipes. Yeah,
Coke.
exactly, just like Coke.
Mhm.
And it creeps up the pipe and it gets to this open convecting lava lake in the crater, and then at that point in time, its internal pressure begins to increase, and then it blows up and throws magma, usually in the crater. But there's this great story that some of the more senior researchers used to tell about. They built a hut called the Lower Erebus Hut, and they got it done one season. It's a lot of work to build a hut, and they came back and there were these like huge Volkswagen sized lava bombs all the
Mm.
way around the hut. And they were like, okay, that one's too close.
We need to move the hut.
We need to, no, they just abandoned it because it's too hard to
Yeah.
move it. So they just
Right. Right.
backed up and built it a little further down the hill.
That's
But yeah,
amazing. So 500 years from now, people are going to be like, what is this thing? Why is that there? Yeah.
no, it's going to be really interesting. So yeah,
That's so
Antarctica was
cool.
a great experience.
I was only there for a week or two. It wasn't that long, but it's an amazing place. The Queen Maudland Mountains, which were on the side, kind of on the, I forgot if it's east west. They call it east west, but that doesn't make any sense. But it was on the South Africa, the place nearest South Africa.
Mhm.
They're like alien. I mean, I've never seen any mountains like those. They're so spectacularly beautiful and unearth-like. In my mind, I don't know. The is Erebus the tallest peak there in
No,
Antarctica?
No, not at all. It sits right in the Ross Sea.
Okay.
And so, the Transantarctic Mountains, I think, are much, much taller than Erebus. And, uh, one of the reasons it's famous is that's where Ross landed, right? And the
Okay.
history of McMurdo. So his hut's still there, and you can still go in and see like all the stuff he left
Right.
behind.
That's
So
cool.
yeah, it was like I said, it was a great experience. It taught me a lot about myself.
Yeah.
Taught me a lot about logistics in the field. So,
Right.
yeah,
The science is probably 5% of what you do, like just staying alive and
yeah,
dealing with the cold and the weather and the getting your stuff there is probably I would imagine is a big part of being a scientist in Antarctica.
yeah. It's a great weight loss program.
Yeah, I'm sure.
You eat a lot of chocolate and you still lose a lot of weight. It's like heaven
Burning a
on
lot of calories.
yeah, because you burn a ton of
Hit
calories.
minus
Yeah,
40. Yeah. Wow.
yeah. So
So yeah.
when I finished my PhD, I went to work for Sandia, and I met a man named Doug Blankenship, and he was the manager of the geothermal technologies department there at Sandia. And that's, so that was kind of my transition. I'd worked on volcanoes. When I left graduate school, I thought, oh man, I really want to go and I want to work on volcanoes. But those jobs are few and far between, and
Hmm.
I got to kind of translate those skills to something else, and that something else was geothermal for me. And it's great community. And my very first project was with an explosives expert named Mark Grublik, and he was developing this waterless fracturing technology. And that's, we say energetic stimulation. Really, what we mean is explosives, downhole
Energetic
explosives.
stimulant. That sounds like an Elon Musk term.
Right. And so
When his rocket blows up, he calls it an uncommanded disassembly.
uncommanded disassembly, right? So energetic stimulations
Yeah.
are hopefully energetic and not just a deflagration, right? Doesn't just burn
Right.
in the borehole. And so that's when, Mark came to me and he said, I really need to understand what these fractures look like in the subsurface. And I'm an explosives guy and you're a seismologist. So can you figure out how to do this? And so we took something actually from an old life. I worked in the non-destructive testing community or in organization and industry for a man named Larry Olson. And we used to test drilled shafts underneath
Mhm.
wikis. And we used something called cross-hole sonic logging. And it's just, it's a slick system. It's great. Its intended use for testing shafts is just, it's great for that. And I thought maybe I could use this in the earth instead of just in the concrete. And so we bought a system and pulled it in, and sure enough, we could image these fractures, and we were shooting, like, imagine a CAT scan, right? And I've got this block of rock that's maybe 4 feet or 8 feet on either side and maybe 50 feet long.
Mhm.
We were shooting something like 45,000 ray paths through it. So our vertical resolution was down to something like an inch. We could see,
Seismic?
yeah, in seismic, because we're shooting super
Wow.
high frequency seismic.
Right.
Um,
High
and
frequency means more accuracy, right?
high frequency just means
Resolution.
it's more sensitive to
Right.
smaller changes in
Right.
seismic velocity, so
Right.
it's more sensitive to fractures and things like that. It can't travel very far, so it's
Right.
a Goldilocks problem. You get all this sensitivity, but you can't really get it to propagate more than just a handful of feet. So we started producing fracture images of his various explosives, and pretty soon he refined it, and we got to go and test it at the full scale in like a real geothermal well, and it was great, right? Like it just I was hooked. So that project actually was part of Secretary Chu had a pet project called Subter, and it was, I think, ahead of its time. And we're unpacking a lot of it now. It was a good vision. like a really good vision. Kind of what we talked about earlier with, you know, how the subsurface is so important to so many things, and the
Right.
understanding and being able to control it is paramount to our success as a human species. And so that led to a project called EGS CoLab, and that really was like, I have no doubt in 20 years when I finally retire, I'll look back and say that project at EGS CoLab was really something special. And so
Mhm.
now, like, my whole goal is, how do you reproduce that, right?
Mhm.
Over and over and over again. Because the collaboration was fantastic. The site was amazing. If you ever get the opportunity to go in the old Homestead Gold Mine, the surf facility, it
Where
is,
is that?
it's remarkable. It's in Leeds, South Dakota.
Okay.
First of
Wow.
all, the people in South Dakota are like the nicest people
I love South Dakota. It's
in
amazing.
the United States.
Yeah.
Um, we worked there for 5 years. They're
Oh,
like
wow.
family.
5
They're like
years.
family, yeah.
Yeah.
And so we built a hydraulic stimulation test bed, intermediate scale. So that means like 10 meters kind of scale, on the 4,850-foot level of the mine. So
Down.
down, that's
Yeah.
right. So the cage ride, they call it a cage. It's like an elevator with no sides, well, or no top really.
Mhm.
It has sides, but it doesn't look like an elevator really.
Mhm.
You and your 30 closest friends
Right.
pile in, and it's an 11-minute ride.
Wow. Ears popping.
Yeah, your ears pop.
The pressure goes up. The pressure's higher than sea level pressure down there, I guess.
I guess so.
Yeah.
You're actually, you go from being at elevation, and on the 4850, you're basically at sea level.
Back down to sea level, yeah.
Yeah. So we'd work down in the mine. So then they're building this incredible project called Dune. And it's a facility they're constructing on that level now. And it's called LBNF, the Long Baseline Neutrino Facility. And they're going to shoot neutrinos from Fermilab and receive them in the mine. And Fermilab's in Illinois.
That's Detroit. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That
So
Midwest.
it's,
Wow.
yeah, so they're going to shoot neutrinos. And I would try to talk about particle physics, but it's something that I understand very poorly. um,
Neutrinos are weird. They're very
so
weird.
so they're building this, and so they needed the space that we had been occupying. So we actually went up to the 4100 level, and we built another test bed. And you can look, my bestie Paul Schwaring and I, we did live broadcasts from the
Oh, wow.
4100 foot level, and we broadcast our experiments and things like that. So it was a
When
really,
we've talked, so is that where you were when we talked before?
yeah, that's
Didn't
right.
I saw you in some crazy, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I was on the 4100 foot level. I think we were trying to show, we're performing a test to show whether shear stimulation actually works in geothermal settings.
Let's talk about geothermal,
Okay.
because kind of energy is kind of my passion, and there's different ways to make energy, and you can burn fossil fuels, and you got nuclear and wind and solar. But geothermal's interesting. It has a huge amount of promise, emissions free, renewable, as long as the center of the earth is like hot.
Yeah.
It's renewable, right? So, but but there's a couple different kinds of geothermal. I've learned a lot in this over the last year. So can you just talk through, like, what is it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, I really think about geothermal in kind of three ways. There's, and this is because I grew up in the DOE, and people might have different interpretations, but I really think about, the shallow subsurface, or geothermal heat pumps, right? Which we've been using for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, right?
My parents have
Because,
one.
yeah, it's great, right? Like, it's just, and our grandparents all knew this, right? We stored food in cellars. I always
Yeah,
think about
right.
that, right? Like,
It's
there
always 60 degrees, 10 feet under your house or whatever, or something like that.
that's right, and so then you just have to make up you have to use some other kind of energy to make up the thermal difference between 60 and whatever you like to set your house at,
If you
right?
want it 69 in the winter, you have to heat it up 9 degrees instead
That's
of heating up the 30-degree air outside. Or in the summertime when it's 90 degrees, you only have to cool it 20 instead of having to cool it 40. It's less work to get the nice and warm or nice and cool inside your house.
yeah, that's right. It's, like, super simple, elegant. It
It's not rocket science.
This is not rocket science, no. So that's one part, and then I think a lot of people are really familiar with the second one, which is hydrothermal systems, and hydrothermal systems are obvious because that's where we all go get in the hot springs, right? So many hydrothermal systems have surface expressions, but I think we're starting to understand that hydrothermal systems may not have thermal expressions. So these are much deeper, much hotter chunks of rock. And the difference between hydrothermal systems and what we'll talk about when we talk about enhanced geothermal systems is hydrothermal systems have natural fractures and water. And so natural convection happens in them. So that's why the surface expression with the hot springs is there. So we've made power from hydrothermal systems for more than 100 years.
Okay. How does
Geysers,
that happen? Hot water comes out and it spins a turbine?
hot water comes up the well, becomes steam, steam drives the turbine.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Just like
there
a coal plant, right? A coal plant heats up water and makes the steam.
that's right,
So instead of burning the coal, you're just using the hot
the hot
rocks
coal, that's right,
down below. Okay.
and the natural convection in the earth too. So, that's how hydrothermal system works.
Where
There's
do they have those? Iceland?
Oh, actually, the US is, like, the leading producer of geothermal energy.
I
Um,
did not know that.
and it almost all of it comes in the Western US.
Mhm.
And the reason that is, right, is because the Western US is largely, constructed in the basin and range, which means that the crust, right, we had compression, and then we had extensional motion in the crust. And so in places, sometimes the crust is very thin, and the hot, like the hot parts of the earth are much closer to the surface in the Western US than
So I learned about something talking to my friend Tony Pink here at NOV. There's the thing, is it called the Yellowstone caldera, maybe?
oh,
It blows up like every 500,000 or 600,000 years.
yeah.
And like it's 60,000 years overdue or something.
Yep.
So there
So
is that.
you know that there's something called when they talk about calderas, right? They have this whole class of calderas that they didn't even know were calderas until they saw them from space. I don't know if you've ever heard this.
Hmm.
So Yellowstone is one of those
Mhm.
that you can't, it's so massive that you can't actually tell that it's a caldera until you see it from space.
Right.
And the other one that one of my favorites is in New Mexico, and it's called Valles,
Mhm.
and it's up by Los Alamos National Labs. But same thing. It wasn't until they got into space that they were like,
Yeah.
wow, that's a volcano.
Right. Well, also where the dinosaur killing rock hit down by Yucatan, like you can see that from space, but it's kind of hard when you're on the ground to realize there's a crater. Now, these aren't calderas, these are craters from, meteors, in Quebec in northeastern Canada. That's super obvious. Like it's the most obvious, it's one of the most obvious features on Earth. Um, and you see it from space. It's the Rimouski or something like that.
Oh, that's
Um,
cool. I'm gonna
Hunter,
have to look that up.
okay, so geothermal, basically you're taking heat out of the ground, and shallow geothermal is easy, but it doesn't produce that much. But if you go deep geothermal, you can get some serious heat. And by the way, energy is a lot of energy is basically heat, right? Heat is a
That's right.
heat is a very valuable commodity. If you have heat, you can do lots of stuff.
That's right.
It's in space. If you have water, you can do lots of stuff. On Earth, if you have heat, you can do lots of different types of energy. So why don't we just drill deep holes and get this super hot heat down at the limitless, endless heat? Why don't we just drill down and get it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Terry.
Doesn't
It
sound that complicated. It's just
it
dirt.
it doesn't, but actually the thing you're talking about is a enhanced geothermal system,
Mhm,
and you can really think about it as you're going to drill two parallel wells, and you're going to generate fractures between them, and you're going to flow water in one well, and you're going to flow water out the other well, and that water, when it comes out, is going to be hot, and it's going to have steam, and it's going to drive a turbine or a generator
mhm.
or something, right? So why is that hard? Well, kudos to Utah Forge and their partnership with you guys and others,
Mhm.
because the leading challenge has been drilling the wells,
Mhm.
and I think you guys have made some serious headway.
Mhm.
And I think we're all waiting with bated breath to see how many more wells you can drill that way.
Right.
So that's kind of one challenge. The other challenge is to generate electricity, you really have to be over about 180 degrees C. And it's an economics problem mostly,
So
right?
100 C, you're boiling,
Yep,
but 180, you're no kidding, getting steam, like a proper amount of steam. Okay.
that's right. And so, you can look at geothermal by the numbers, but really above 180 C, that's where you start to derive real electricity potential.
Mhm.
And that's what we're talking about. We're talking, right, really, when we talk about energy, it's about decarbonizing the grid.
Mhm.
And so once you drill the wells, right, then you got to generate these fractures. It's very challenging to break rock in deep crystalline environments.
So
The
you can drill down and drill because you have to have the water go down and come back and go down. It's got to be a circle,
Right,
but
that's
you
the
need to have some fractures between the two at the bottom so that the cold water can go get warmed up and then come back out as hot. And
that's right.
it's these connecting fractures that's the
Fractures,
problem.
yeah.
That is a problem.
It's like a radiator,
Right.
right? Yeah,
Right. That's a good, all right.
yeah. So the radiator is, you're trying to build a radiator, basically, and you're trying to do that 7 kilometers into the earth.
It's
So
it's hot, there's pressure, it's in rock, it's not in jello, right?
that's right. And, it's a four-dimensional problem. So geothermal plants, right, at this point in time, and these are largely non-technical barriers, right? When we talk to, you know, when we teach seminars and things, we make sure to point out, to at least to the next generation, that energy prices are what they are because there's a whole non-technical driver that makes energy prices what they are, right? And it could be tax incentives, it could be, who gets to lobby Congress and who doesn't, or who does it more effectively or who doesn't. And so geothermal, I think,
Wars,
or wars.
OPEC production curtailment.
That's right. I was listening to your podcast the other day about that. It's
Mhm.
it's it's interesting, right? But I think people think, "Oh, why is it challenging?" And so as a scientist, I say, "Okay, well, it's challenging because you got to drill these really deep wells, you got to
Mhm.
make these fractures. They need to behave for a really, really long time in
Right.
a really stable way, which is pretty hard. So you might have a fracture that steals more water than all its counterparts, and that
Right.
would be called like a thief zone. And that fracture then wouldn't produce as much heat. It would
Right.
cool quicker, right? So
Right.
that means your radiator isn't actually working the way a radiator should.
Right.
Every fracture should take about the same amount of water, and then you get this really steady state thing. This is what a hydrothermal system has kind of naturally, right? They
Right.
have this convection down, down deep in the earth, and that's what helps make them sustainable. So
So
now you're just trying to reproduce it.
if you just drilled holes, two strings, and they connected, you could make it would be a circle, but there would be no heat transfer, right? Because you just have the one tube and you really need lots of surface area. Heat transfer is all about surface area, right?
Heat transfer is all about surface area, but this is actually a concept, and it's called a closed loop concept, and it's being tested now because
Mhm.
I think a company called Everloop
Mhm.
has now drilled 2 wells and met them what
Oh,
we would
wow.
call toe to toe.
Right.
And so we'll see if it works. If it works, it's great. There's, we understand that heat transfer is proportional to surface area, and so I think the biggest concerns right now is that there won't be enough surface area. But that is one way to engineer your way out of it.
Very
Is,
interesting.
is
So how far, when will we start? Oh, and by the way, can you just do geothermal anywhere? Is
yeah,
10,000 feet down, there's always heat everywhere on Earth? Because like I said, Iceland is pretty good for geothermal. Yellowstone is pretty good for geothermal, but New York State is not necessarily the same as Yellowstone's. But when you're going really deep, that's for the shallow stuff. But when you're going really deep, you can go a lot more places, right?
you can go a lot more places.
Yeah.
So
Antarctica.
it maybe, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about ever drilling in Antarctica.
Yeah.
It's so pristine that
Well,
I
yeah, that's a different, yeah.
I feel like maybe we shouldn't.
Yeah.
Um, but it's the Western US is a good example. Anything along the Ring of Fire, right? Um, we haven't even really explored what would geothermal offshore look like, right? I
I've
mean,
never, we have off, like NOV builds lots of offshore rigs.
right. But why do we have to do geothermal on land? I don't think we do. Um, I
Well, you
think
want the electricity, then you're generating a megawatt of electricity offshore, and which
yeah,
that's what we're doing with offshore wind.
that's right. You have to figure out the transmission problem, but
Yeah.
offshore wind has to as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there's just lots of opportunity,
What's
anywhere.
the advantage there? You mean you might have better geology?
Well, it's further away from people, so if your operations are disruptive, one of the things about geothermal that people have always said is, well, don't build the geothermal plant because it's in this beautiful place with these hot springs or,
Right.
whatever. Well, we now can access deeper in the earth due to great drilling technology.
Yeah.
And so I think it's time to kind of think outside the box about where geothermal could be developed. In
Hmm.
New York,
I never thought about that.
in New York, right? Like, it's a good example because the earth, the crust at say 6.5 kilometers, which is kind of the standard, depth that people evaluate temperature for geothermal exploration. The temperature is much cooler than it would be, say, in like somewhere in Nevada or California.
Wyoming. Yeah.
So,
20,000 feet.
yeah. But you look at it and it's still pretty warm, right? So
Mhm.
maybe you can't generate electricity there, but there's lots of great stuff you can do under 180 degrees C.
Mhm.
You can do district heating,
Mhm.
right? You
Yeah.
can heat greenhouses, which might be important. The
Mhm.
cement process, all of the cement process is greatly helped
It's all
by
about heat
it's all
and
about
heat
heat.
and heat recovery. A
That's
lot
right.
of these industrial processes, they have these heat recovery, like they'll burn something, but then they try and capture the wasted heat that didn't get used. Yeah, it's all about heat. If you just having hot water is very useful for lots of stuff.
That's right. So I mean, when you think about it that way, like maybe you don't have to put energy into the grid or electricity into the grid in a
Mhm.
geothermal setting in New York. But maybe we take a look at our infrastructure and we go, okay, we can do this better. And if we make these kinds of investments, then, we can heat our greenhouses or
Yeah,
we can,
absolutely.
do.
Or our apartment buildings, hot water. I mean, I talked to it was a VC fund in Europe that wanted to build these types of things. Scandinavia actually has a lot of this. They have a lot of district heating, geothermal already. That's really interesting. Or if you're burning natural gas to make hot water steam turbines. Well, I think they don't do that. I think the natural gas actually spins the turbine directly, but
I think
yeah,
that's how that
yeah,
works too.
yeah,
But it's, anywhere where you're trying to heat something up
yeah.
or deal with that, that kind of industrial process.
which is everywhere that there's human activity, basically.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's more or less efficient, right? Like I think there should be a technical analysis done. Um,
So
a lot of opportunity.
we need to get better at drilling. We need to get better at doing the fractures to connect the two wells to get to build the radiator down
Yep.
underground. And we need pipes and seals and rubber joints and that can survive. This stuff gets up to like 500 or 600 C if I remember. I think
Super hot. Yeah.
hundreds and hundreds of C, which is a lot. That's
Yeah.
even more hundreds of F.
That's right. So I think, yeah, it's an astute observation, right? We need better materials because one of the things that's going to happen is the stuff we have today is, and again, right, this is really, what is the saying? It's like necessity breeds innovation.
Right.
Okay, so we took a lot of things from the oil industry that they had developed for downhole operations, and they never needed to work at the temperatures we're working, right? So the materials that they built, the things they built are phenomenal, right? I mean, just mind-blowing phenomenal. But they don't always work in geothermal settings because they didn't need to design those instruments or those materials to do those things. So really, we just need to go back and we need to look at what we can take and how we can modify it and then move forward.
And that's where the National Lab comes in because I do different businesses. It would be hard for me to go to an investor and go, hey, can I have $10 million to drill this well and see if it works? And they're going to be like, maybe Jeff Bezos would do that, but most investors are not. But the government is willing to do that. And
That's right.
If they drill well and it doesn't work, they got more taxes coming. But then you guys as scientists, you can put that in your list of lessons learned, and that's where the government public-private partnership, you can help companies with what you've learned, and companies don't have to spend that R&D money.
That's right. That's really what national labs are here to do, is to I think we're really good at taking a concept and saying, okay, let's figure out how to either from models or experiments validate whether that concept is going to work in this application. And then we come back and we say, okay, here are all the things we learned. And we think now is a good chance to take it from, this level to the next level where it could be commercially applied. And we release it and companies like NOV or other places pick it up and run with it. And it's cool, right? Like super cool things have come out of the National Lab. LiDAR is one of them.
Right.
How
I did my rendezvous in space was with LiDAR. It's like radar only with lasers.
But it's awesome, right? But directional drilling.
Directional drilling is amazing.
Yep.
So it's amazing what they can do drilling a hole underground.
Yeah, it's unreal. So there's just been lots of cool and useful technology that's come out of the national labs that is hopefully helping make the world a better and safer and more sustainable place.
It's what it's all about. And energy is what drives everything. If you have energy, you can have a happy, healthy life. And if you don't have energy, you don't. So it's super important.
Yeah, absolutely. It touches the subsurface, really touches every bit of our daily lives.
Right.
It's an important thing to understand.
It's very cool. I like rocks. Well, Hunter, thank you for your time. This has been amazing. It's been almost an hour here, but this is super cool stuff. Volcanoes are cool, and drilling is cool, and hopefully especially the geothermal. I'm like, of all the technologies out there, that really could be world changing. I mean, it really could be. It's emission free, renewable. If we can figure out how to do it, there's some tough challenges, but we can figure out how to get that going. That's really, it's a game changer that nobody's talking about. Everybody says wind and solar. You listen to my other podcast to find out why those are not maybe the best options. Geothermal is potentially very cool.
I think I'll leave you with this. Someone once told me, early on in my career, I said, well, what is the goal? What is really the goal in energy? And they said, this person, very smart person, said to me, It's to have a portfolio that looks like your financial portfolio. You want diversity in it.
Dogecoin?
No,
Dogecoin?
no. Maybe none of that. But you want this diverse portfolio
Right.
because that in the end makes it more secure, more sustainable.
Right.
And so will geothermal solve all of the problems? Probably not.
Yeah.
It is 24 hours, 7 days a week, baseload power.
Right.
Very few renewables that can make that claim.
Doesn't require these crazy lithium and cobalt mines in Africa. Is not dependent on China.
That's right.
Ask Europe what it's like to be dependent on an authoritarian dictator for their energy. So yeah, there's a lot of good. So hopefully we can get some of this stuff going.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it, Hunter. And again, about Down to Earth with Terry Virts. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating. We'd appreciate it. And thanks, Hunter, for coming on.
Thank you.